Previously, on Murdaugh Mafia Rise and Fall, we traced the Murdaugh family history back many generations, and we found that it wasn't until Alex's great-grandfather, Josiah Putnam Murdaugh Jr., that the Murdaughs crossed over from farming to business. Josiah Jr. and his wife, Annie Marvin Davis, put education at the forefront in their children's lives, and their son, Randolph Sr., became the first Murdaugh with a law degree. He accumulated a good amount of wealth but lost the majority of it when one of his banks failed during the Depression. Randolph Jr., better known as Buster, immediately sued the railway company after his father's death, and as we learned in the last episode, Gravy Train worked hard to build that wealth back up. Buster had grown up with his father, first his mother, and then two stepmoms, throwing lavish parties with high-level people in attendance. They had one of the first cars in town, a boat, and many other luxuries. Now, with Buster making a name for himself, he must have grown quite impatient to have that lifestyle again. That kind of lifestyle can burn through money rather quickly, especially during wartime when supplies are harder to come by. Large legal wins can go as quickly as they come, so Buster was in a constant struggle for his next big case. But in those times, there was something almost as important as money. It was society. Long before the days of TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, and Facebook, there was the society page. The society page was where the influencers of that day were posted. On the coveted society page, information such as who went for a visit, who had a visit, who played in the bridge club, who threw a bridal shower, all played out in black and white print. Decorations, food, beverages, clothes, music, it was all carefully described on that envious page. If your name wasn't on that page, you were not a part of high society. Some families rarely missed a week on it, while others struggled to ever get a mention. On this episode, we're going to have a look at how diligently Buster worked to keep his name around town and break into that coveted society page. Who the competition was when he first entered, and we'll lay the groundwork for how one particular family was about to become entangled with the Murdaughs. And later we'll learn how his name and the newspapers didn't exactly end up as he had hoped. Let's get started. I'm Cassidy O'Connell, and this is Murdaugh Mafia Rise and Fall, Episode 5, High Society, Contemporaries, and Connections. Welcome. Though Buster was able to ride on his father's coattails to become solicitor of the 14th Judicial Circuit, it was not a position that guaranteed him big money or a big position in society. There would be a lot more to building the Murdaugh family. Buster and Gladys also had some catching up to do in order to match some of the other well-positioned families of the day. There were families who had a head start, having become regular fixtures long before Buster and Gladys ever made it to the page. Just glancing through these society pages was exhausting. I can't imagine trying to live through it. Buster's father had owned a newspaper for a time, but now they had to get out there and try to get their names picked up on their own. If you watched Palm Royale, you saw how desperate main character Maxine Delacourt was to get on the shiny sheet. The shiny sheet is a fictitious society page of that place and time. The society page was the place to be if you were about making a name for yourself. Here we see Buster getting involved in every possible thing he can. We see him as the Hampton County chairman for the American Red Cross. We see him as the vice president of the law school alumni. He's a director for the Varnville National Farm Loan Association, another position of power, because he gets to help approve or disapprove farm loans. He's also a member of the Columbia Lodge of Elks, and the third vice president of the Wade Hampton Lions Club. He's pictured here on the back right, sitting on the South Carolina Bar Association's nominating committee. He's the state committeeman in the Hampton County Democratic Convention, and also the executive member to the state convention for the Hampton County Democratic Club. He's part of the University of South Carolina Bar Association, serving as their vice president. And he's part of general counsel and executive committeemen that were elected by the South Carolina Bar Association, where he serves as general counsel. He also gets involved in festivals and exhibitions such as we see here, the Watermelon Festival and a cutting exposition. He's attorney for the town of Varnville and serves on the University Board of Trustees. A very busy man indeed. It gets so out of hand, a local member of the House of Representatives, a lawyer, and an activist, John Bolt Culbertson, actually brought a suit before the South Carolina Supreme Court to try to stop men from going against what the Constitution allows for holding positions of honor and profit. The suit specifically dealt with General Assembly members who also served as trustees of the University of South Carolina. He brought out that the Constitution actually prohibited this and named 7 men who were currently breaking that rule. Buster was one of the 7. In his action, he put himself forth as acting as a taxpayer representing himself and all others similarly situated. A few months later in May, he gets his answer when the Supreme Court dismisses his case. Their grounds were that he lacked sufficient legal interest to institute it. In their response, several of them state their opinions. For example, D. Gordon Baker held that legislative action cannot be nullified at the suit of any of the tens of thousands of citizens who may have the qualifications of taxpayers. Which is a good point. Imagine the chaos if just any taxpayer, and we're all taxpayers, could bring these kinds of suits to the court. Judge Grimble adds that if and when a suit is brought by a properly qualified plaintiff for the enforcement of the provisions of the Constitution, the court should not hesitate in requiring complete compliance with that document. So basically they're saying, yes, this goes against the Constitution. Yes, if the right party came forward, the court would handle it, but you are not that right party. Culbertson's argument was that constitutional provisions prohibit the holding at the same time of more than one position of honor or profit, and that no person shall be eligible to a seat in the General Assembly while he holds any office or position of profit or trust under the state. And his demand is that the offices to which these trustees were first elected to be declared vacant since they've accepted an additional position. Justice Baker says where Culbertson falls short is that he doesn't have any personal interest in the matters here, that he has no showing of any individual rights that are being violated or that he's suffering any type of damages, nor can he prove that any public funds or property has been misapplied or unlawfully diverted, and therefore his position simply as taxpayer, he doesn't rightly have a claim. They also say they do not have the power over legislation because the Senate and House of Representatives are the judges of the qualifications of their own members, so the power does not lie with their court. And they do reiterate what they've already said, that if the suit were properly brought by a person having a legal interest in the matter, that the court in such a suit would be readily enforceable. So basically, an admittance that these guys are doing something against the Constitution. It's simply not Culbertson's right to bring this suit, and it's not within their power to take action on this suit, unless the proper person comes forward, and of course, no one does. And so these 7 continue on against the Constitution, holding more than one place. A police school opens up in Hampton, though probably set up from higher agencies than himself, since we see that it does involve the FBI training them. It's a school for peace officers for the counties of the 14th Judicial Circuit. It's held in collaboration with the FBI and the state constabulary. It's supposed to help the officers to be better equipped to perform their jobs. It has a list of FBI representatives who are going to be there to teach and to train. It's supposed to include scientific lab work, jurisdiction, investigation, notes and report writing, interviews and confessions, collection of evidence, techniques of arrest, hit-and-run driving, and drunken driving. It goes on with defensive tactics, introduction of fingerprint taking, descriptions, laws of arrests and searches, rules of evidence, and courtroom behavior. This is all well thought out, well planned, and well beyond the scope of Buster's knowledge. The mere fact that it does include the FBI makes me think, as I said, that this was arranged by much higher agencies than Buster. But as we see in this article, Buster takes all the credit for the opening of the school. Throughout the interviews and books that I've read, Buster worked very hard to ingratiate himself to the police, often appearing to be their advocate. This was something that he was able to use to his advantage on many occasions. At the same time, we see another man's name mentioned very, very often. A name I know will be familiar to probably most of you, and that's the name Boulware. If you recall, it was a man by the name of Barrett Boulware who had co-owned multiple properties with Alex and was the original owner of Moselle. There was a mysterious bill of sale between him and Barrett for the shockingly low price of $5. We also heard Alex confessing to stealing money from Barrett as Barrett lay dying of cancer, even though Barrett's widow desperately needed money to be able to stay close to the hospital where Barrett was being treated. The Boulwares and the Murdaughs go way back, it seems. Randolph Sr. and Thomas McCullough Boulware III, who'd come from several generations of lawyers and other learned men, were contemporaries, both serving as attorneys in the 14th Circuit. They often found themselves head-to-head with one prosecuting and the other defending the same cases, which kept them rival contemporaries on the job. They also had a handful of cases that they worked together. The Boulwares were well known and well established, with each generation seeming to marry better than the last and elevating the name even more. There was hardly a day that went by without one of their names popping up in the paper, and I don't think I saw a single society page of that time that didn't list some detail of their charmed lives. Whether it was one of the many Mrs. Boulwares holding bridge club, or throwing a bridal shower, a son enlisting in the war, or a child being born, the society page followed their every move. There are many branches of the Boulware family, 2 of them being dominant amongst high society. These 2 main branches share a common ancestor by the name of Musco William Boulware. One branch focused on medicine and the other law. There was even a set of twins who became doctors. When one of the twins only had daughters, the other named his youngest son for his twin brother to carry on the name Dr. John Hugh Boulware II, similar to how John Marvin named his youngest son Randolph V when Randy only had daughters. But we're going to focus on the Thomas Boulware family because this is the law branch that became very connected to the Murdaughs. Aside from these 2 main branches, there were other cousins who were in charge of different committees and the Highway Commission. This family will have several entanglements with the Murdaughs through the years, from Thomas Boulware III and Randolph Sr. down to our time with Alex Murdaugh and Barrett Boulware Jr. So we're going to sidetrack a little into their origins to set that stage up. Thomas Boulware III married Vera Thomas on July 18, 1918. She immediately assumed her role as a high society wife and was one of the most mentioned Boulwares in all society pages throughout her life. She hosted many events and attended many clubs, from bridge to music to books. Just about any women's club there was at the time, she was there and had a leading role. Somehow, she still managed to give birth to 2 daughters and 3 sons while keeping up this pace. It wasn't long after Buster succeeded his father as solicitor that Thomas Boulware was appointed as a judge. Now, instead of legal rivals, the Boulwares and the Murdaughs were free to have a relationship without the animosity of playing on the opposite teams. The two made names for themselves in earnest, not just joining, but leading every club, convention, committee, delegation, or business that they possibly could. On one occasion, Buster actually had an organization created and became the president of it. Boulware's advantage remained evident when he received nominations and roles that would never be offered to Buster. Their reputations were miles apart as well. While Buster was humiliated for his bad behavior on multiple occasions, as we'll see in upcoming podcasts, Boulware's shiny, happy family was the quintessential charm and grace, with a son and a daughter being well known for their service during World War II. During the time Buster was busy using his position in the war effort to charm the skirt off of Ruth Vaux and producing a son whilst they were both married to other people, Thomas Boulware's oldest son and namesake was a local hero often written up in the papers. We follow his story starting here when he first enters into the service, joining the Air Corps as a cadet. He does very well and is one of the seniors chosen in his class to become an instructor to other students. The locals watched him all along the journey, as every step of his way is documented. As seen here, even simple things like it was time for him to have his examination. He passes and he graduates with the rank of 2nd lieutenant. He then goes on to finish flight school in March 1942, and we see him pictured here on the far right. This clipping being when he received his wings. Just 6 months later, in December, he's promoted to 1st lieutenant. Naturally, such a high achiever from such a high-level family, he's bound to marry well. While he's busy in the Air Corps, Alston Brinkley, daughter of well-known surgeon Dr. Frederick Cannon Brinkley, who also served as the mayor of Ellington and 2 terms as a senator, was selected as the Queen of Ellington in 1939 and was one of 8 runners-up to the Azalea Festival in Charleston in 1940. She also represented as a queen for a festival reenacting the bombardment of Fort Sumter. She was the epitome of high society, as well as being quite beautiful. We see her here in the upper right of this picture. They were married at her home on April the 4th, 1942, and in the write-up she's described as one of Ellington's loveliest and most popular girls. After they were married, they moved to Rhode Island where he was stationed, and they lived there until he was ordered to foreign duty 3 months later on July the 1st. Information from his letters to his parents is shared with the newspapers, and we learn he's fighting in different places in Africa, where he, as 1st lieutenant, is credited with shooting down at least 1 Nazi airplane, saying that there were possibly more, but that they're not counted as downed unless they are confirmed by being seen actually hit the ground. We see he left a piece of himself when he headed to Africa, because on January 31st, 1943, Alston, who'd returned home with her parents while Tom was away, gives birth to Tom's son, Thomas McCullough Boulware V. In this announcement, Tom is incorrectly referred to as the 3rd and his son the 4th, but Tom's father is the 3rd, making him the 4th and his son the 5th. The couple received good news in May when Tom is one of a select group being sent back to the U.S. to help train pilots. And so it is finally on June the 17th, he returns home where he's met at the airport by his wife and his parents, and he goes home to meet his now 5-month-old son. On July 7th, the newspapers report a harrowing story of why it is that he wears a bullet on his crash bracelet. It says that he wears it as a souvenir of his first real fight with the enemy. The bullet is described as an armor-piercing projectile which was dug from the wheel of his plane after the scrap. The reason he wears it is as a constant reminder not to break one of the first rules of a combat pilot, to stay with his squadron. This bullet, before lodging in his wheel, went through his cockpit. It was his first real scrap, and though he'd been drilled never to separate from his squadron, he broke that rule and peeled off, following a Messerschmitt plane, which he'd spotted. He engaged the plane in a 5-minute dogfight and thought that he had himself a Nazi, only to find that he was about to get in trouble. He followed the Nazi pilot up to an altitude of about 15,000 feet in a climb almost straight up. And those of you not familiar with planes, this kind of climb can cause the engine to fail. His plane was about to roll over on its back, the motor was beginning to conk out, and his ammunition was gone. Only then did he decide to try to get out of there. He pulled his plane over backwards and headed straight down, going over 500 miles per hour. After he dropped about 6,000 feet, he sees a plane right on his tail. At this point, out of ammunition, he's ready to give up, but he hears a voice over the radio. "Tommy, it's me, Denny." It was a member of his own squadron. Denny had seen him head down after his battle with the Nazi and had come to aid him. Having survived what could have been a disaster, he learned his lesson and had the bullet put on his crash bracelet to remind him never to do that again. Another of his stories found its way to the New York Times. This time, it happened during the bombing of Sicily. There were 2 American fighter pilots that ran out of ammunition while they were being attacked by 3 fighters. The dispatch said they bluffed the enemy airmen into giving up the fight by attacking fiercely, as though intent on getting into position to shoot down their opponents. Unfortunately, money and high society does not mean a happily ever after. After surviving Nazi attacks over Italy and the deserts of Africa, Tom's plane crashed over Long Island Sound while performing training maneuvers on March 11, 1944, having been home for 8 months. The initial reports say that he was killed in a plane crash, but a few days later, Tom's father wanted the details of his death to be known. Perhaps his father felt it was an insult to his flying skills for people to think that that's how he died. Or maybe it was just a matter of setting the facts straight. But the actual story is quite sad. Tom was not killed in a crash. His plane caught fire and went out of control. He fought and brought it back into control and was able to bail out. But he was 15 miles off of Montauk Point. It was late March and the ocean was icy. His Mae West kept his head, arms, and chest out of the water so that his wallet and a letter that was to be mailed to his parents didn't get wet. Unfortunately, he wasn't found very quickly. He was in the water for more than an hour, with the water being 18 degrees. He was able to hail a fishing boat that brought him on board, but being thoroughly soaked and then brought out into the freezing air, he died within 15 minutes while he was being transferred to another boat. The cause of death was exhaustion and exposure. The entire area, who had followed his story through these years, all grieved with the family. He was their local hero, who seemed to have the best of life ahead of himself. These were the kinds of families the Murdaughs were up against in the society pages. Where Randolph Sr. had been seen as a righteous sort of fellow, Buster was having trouble staying out of trouble. And so these kinds of society page write-ups were so far out of his reach. Instead, as we see in this article, people attending the court sessions for entertainment. They didn't have TV, a lot couldn't afford movies. The court sessions were free, and Buster used it to his advantage, acting like an actor in a play. Instead, he had to resort to courtroom theatrics to gain a sort of entertainer status, being everyone's buddy while out and about, and of course, the connections he gained by being involved in as many committees, groups, delegations, and businesses as he possibly could. And then, of course, aligning himself with families like the Bulwers. Thomas Bulwer III had another son, Barrett Thomas Bulwer. Unlike his brother, Barrett didn't make any newspaper headlines in the 40s, and he's only found sparingly inside more mundane articles. His wife appears in flower show and home decorating articles, and he appears as a horse pitcher in the Barnwell Rodeo, a member of a jury, groomsman in weddings, and third place in a sports writing award article for writing for the Sumter Daily Item. His story will get bigger much later, and it's him and his son that become tangled up in drug smuggling and property deals with the Murdaughs, as mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. Besides the Boulware connection, there was another one that also helped him make other very important connections. We see Buster often connected to George Warren, the senator we heard about in episode 2 who represented Buster in his suit for Randolph Sr.'s death. We see here Buster was invited to join an exclusive hunting trip along with Warren that included the governor. Now, as an example for how connected to each other these people in power were, let's take a look. I started reading about George Warren because this 1940 newspaper was just too unbelievable. It states that he was only 16 in 1916 when he was elected to be a circuit judge but turned it down. As far as I know, you can't be a judge without passing the bar. We also know he served as solicitor before Randolph Sr. from 1916 to 1920, so I was really thrown by that. In reality, he was born on November 25th, 1887. He graduated from Clemson College in 1908 at the age of 21. He studied law under his uncle and passed the bar in 1909 at the age of 22 and became solicitor in 1916 at the age of 25. Among his many other accomplishments, he was the president of the South Carolina Bar Association from 1938 to 1950 when he retired. Besides of all of his legal accomplishments, he was also known for being instrumental in bringing in the plywood plastics factory to Hampton, a much-needed source of jobs for the area. It later became known as Westinghouse Micarta, then International Paper, and later became Nevamar. But he's an example of just what I mean about friend and family connections. His father was an attorney before him. George married very well to Rita Louise Lightsey of Brunson. They had 2 children, but she died after only 7 years of marriage from pneumonia that was caused by influenza. She was the daughter of William Henry Lightsey, a state senator who lived in Hampton County. He was the son of a captain who attended Greenville Military School. He was the mayor of Brunson and the former president of the Hampton County Fair Association. He served in the House of Representatives from 1925 to 1930 and in the state senate since 1931. So she came from a very well-connected family. To make things even more interesting, let's build on this family tree a little. Rita's mother is Annie Lavinia Hughes Lightsey. Lightsey, by the way, was a huge name in the area. The family owned some of the largest businesses, a sawmill, a wood furniture business, with another Lightsey serving as sheriff. Shortly before the death of Randolph Sr., one of the last cases he had worked with Buster was for a Lightsey. Though they stuck it to defendants in personal injury cases, this time they were representing the defendant, W. Frederick Lightsey. And unlike some of the defendants they'd sued for lots and lots of money, for example, the railways, in situations where nothing malicious had been done, their client, Mr. Lightsey, attacked a salesman. Though it doesn't say what prompted the attack, the Lightseys were known far and wide for being not just frugal, but maliciously frugal, making it difficult to work for them. So I'm thinking it could possibly have involved money, since he was a typewriter salesman, and a typewriter would have been something the Lightseys needed. As we see in the only write-up I could find, R.C. Rabb, this typewriter salesman, files a $50,000 damage suit because W. Fred Lightsey hurled a pistol at him and struck him in the back as he attempted to flee from the defendant's office, where he had been unjustly attacked. It's described in the complaint that he entered the office with his superior, an R.L. Barnhart, so he had a witness. Lightsey drew a pistol on him, cursed him, abused him, and hurled the pistol at him as he attempted to flee. Now this man is left with arms and shoulders paralyzed because of the blow of the pistol hitting him. It had to have struck very hard and hit at a specific point, probably the neck, I'm guessing, that did damage, leaving him paralyzed. Although the Murdaughs get these kind of damages for their clients, they limit this man to only $3,000. He's left paralyzed, can no longer work. He's only 49 years old, and the Murdaughs make sure that their client only has to pay $3,000. This is one of the ways that Buster was able to gain favor with important people in the area, and why it was often said, "Go to Buster, he'll fix it." This was the same year an article was published saying that businesses were afraid of South Carolina because they were afraid of the courts, especially the juries. The name of the article was called A Plea for Understanding, and it mentions businesses are afraid to come to South Carolina because, as I said, they're afraid of the courts and especially the juries, and it mentions that the effect is the same whether the fear is justified or not justified. So basically, with this reputation, even if it's not real, it's still stopping businesses from coming in. So it's called A Plea for Understanding because they're begging for something to be done. In the article, the writer Henry Chaplin says, "It's doubly difficult for us to understand the decisions of the courts of South Carolina over the past years and into the present, which have granted large punitive damages to individuals based upon fraudulent intent on the part of some of the most highly respected companies in the country." It mentions one specific recent judgment where punitive damages for many times more than the face of the policy was given based on fraudulent intent, and towards the end reiterates that it's becoming increasingly difficult to operate in South Carolina, and the magnitude of such a catastrophe cannot be measured. And it asks for people who read this article to consider it in the spirit that it's being made. This prompts a sharp response from attorney and Judge Thomas M. Boulware III. But as an attorney who's been involved in such cases, he feels personally attacked, saying that he knows of no such cases where suits were filed fraudulently. He claims that Mr. Chaplin simply does not know the facts, and then he criticizes the paper for even printing the article. The editor responds that airing such matters is what can get them investigated, and that the paper is not attempting to try a case, but simply encouraging fair and broad investigation. He ends the letter by making the point: maybe Mr. Chaplin was in error regarding fraudulent intent. Maybe the law holds the punitive damages may be awarded for breach of contract with fraudulent intent. It still remains an enormous power and a dangerous one. If honest business people prefer an apprehension of such power, the Commonwealth should be able to remove such apprehension if experience has provided no foundation for it. So he's saying if it's not actually fraudulent, clear it up, but something needs to be done with this situation, because the fact was businesses were afraid to enter South Carolina. And we've often heard this said, that the high rate of suits and the excessive punitive damages long held any sort of industrial growth from entering the area, and this created a huge disparity between the wealthy and the average person. There were simply not enough jobs to support the lower and middle class living because the suits only made the law firms wealthy with a select few clients and kept out job opportunities from the rest. Getting back to Annie Lightsey, Annie's maiden name is Hughes, so the connection didn't pop up so quickly till I did some digging. It turns out Annie has a brother whose name was in episode 1 about Randolph Murdaugh Sr., so if you recognize it, that's why. Her brother is Dr. Joseph Brantley Harvey. Do you recognize it yet? He married Eleanor Causey, and they are the parents of Etta Causey Harvey, the first wife of Randolph Sr., Buster's mother. Now, I was wondering how can that be since Annie's maiden name was Hughes and her brother's name is Harvey. So it turns out Annie is the only listed parent for Dr. Joseph Harvey, and there's no record of her parents at all, only that her maiden name was Steedley. At first I thought it could be that she was a widow who immigrated with her young son and married Major Hughes, but it lists her birthplace as Barnwell. And on the census record, we see Joe Harvey listed as stepson, leaving the mystery of who his father is wide open. But the point is that all of these connections mean that Randolph Sr. and George Warren are cousins by marriage, and therefore their alliance makes sense. Reading from Tangled Vines by John Glatt, it states, Buster had a few people he kept close and away from harm, explained Kim Brandt, a Hampton businesswoman who knew the Murdaughs. When he was unhappy with a certain person, it was their job to handle it. Another Hampton resident, who wished to remain anonymous, said the tough law and order solicitor could also look the other way when it came to his friends. As a little girl, she said, I remember Daddy saying, "Go to Buster Murdaugh. He'll make it disappear." It was always that good old boy system. Getting people to make statements against the Murdaughs is still difficult to this day. But what these women allege is that Buster had a group of people around him that would handle keeping himself and a few people out of harm. And the second woman saying Buster could make things disappear. It's absolutely naive to believe that the judges and men in authority could spend the day hunting with the man or having drinks with his wife at his home during a lavish party and then judge him fairly the next day in court. We've only considered 2 examples of Buster's connections in this episode, but there were so very many more. And these are the tangled webs that create and foster a good old boys club. In our next episode, we'll find out how these connections helped him slip out of some pretty big holes he dug himself into when we consider the first investigation into Buster's unprofessional behavior. As a quick follow-up, Thomas McCullough Bulwer III's daughter Vera, who also followed her brother's path and joined the military, lived a very long and happy life. In fact, she lived long enough to see the murders of Maggie and Paul and Alex's arrest, and possibly knew of him stealing money from her nephew, Barrett Bulwer Jr. She passed away on December the 2nd, 2022, at the age of 103. Captain Tom's son, Thomas McCullough V, grew up and married Diana Barnett Morris, who bore him Thomas McCullough Bulwer VI, who is currently a very successful realtor in Charleston. Thank you so much for sharing this journey with me and for all your wonderfully kind comments. If this is your first time watching, this is episode 5 in this series. I'll link episodes 1 to 4 and pin them in the comments so that you can just click on them to watch from the beginning. This is Cassidy O'Connell saying stay well and stay tuned.